Back in time, April 1982. Seems a long time ago, some of it, until I start looking at the pictures, and then sometimes it just seems like yesterday. But this one, okay, it's about Lake Powell. This just caught my eye because there's so much stuff, and I'll show you even more stuff later, that is still theory back then. Even with me and other guys, we're still trying to get the reality separated from the theory of really how things work in the fishing world. And this is one where it reminds me, it says, Lake Powell striper fishing is growing up. And I've got in constant battles directly with the Utah conservation people, Arizona conservation people, that's the worst thing they ever did to those Colorado River lakes with stripers. And this one reminded me of the argument I had with the Utah Conservation. I was with BASS out in Phoenix with all the conservation departments from every state there. And we got into a friendly argument, and I said, you know, that's the worst thing you could do. And of course they disagreed, and I said, well, they said, and I said, they will destroy the food population. And he said, the food base, and they said, no, they won't, because they will not be able to reproduce in Lake Powell because they'd have to run up the Colorado River, which is cold, too cold for them to spawn, because that water comes out of the Rocky Mountains. And then 10 years later, I'll run into this guy again, and that's an approximate date for him. And he comes up to me and says, you were right. And it was never about, it's because it's subjective if you like stripers. A lot of people do. We bass fishermen, we don't, because we know that it decimates the forage base, and then everything gets unhealthy in the lake. And they even state in this article, well, you know, they're good for lakes, because when the lakes get 7, 8 years old, then they start to decline. Then the stripers make up for it. Well, that's partially true, because the stripers helped it decline. But anyway, they said they are spawning in Lake Powell. They are reproducing. And this fascinated me when he told me. I said, really, up the river? He said, no. They're spawning right at the dam, which back then was about 400 feet deep. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He says, you know, the whole key to striper eggs is, that's why they go up rivers, is that they tumble when they spawn, so they don't get covered up with silt. And he said, what they learned was to go down to a certain depth, let's just say 100 feet, and their eggs would suspend. They wouldn't sink any further. And so now they're doing the same thing as if they're tumbling. And they're reproducing. He said they adjusted. They found a way to survive. So it's fascinating to me, because we've kind of gone through that whole thing and see what nature's capable of doing. And this is kind of another, I guess this is kind of my protest series. I just did one here, but nowadays I look at the Lions, and of course these are all guys that, these were U.S. Open winners, and Harold won, and then second at the Classic, and Stanley Mitchell was second. But there's only, to me, okay, I'm going to tell you right now, unless you're a spinning rod fisherman, and that's where you got to take what I'm fixing to say into context. I'm a power angler. I fish heavy stuff, and usually in heavy cover. There's only 2 good lines left, okay, 2. One of them is Bass Pro Shop XL monofilament, and the other one is Trilene, saltwater Trilene. They're monofilaments. None of the other lines I will fish, because they can't handle tough conditions. And that's why I said, if you're a spinning rod fisherman, okay, because spinning rod anglers are using light equipment, where I tend to use heavy equipment. Just a little personal advice there. And this one here is really kind of a hard one for me to do. The Dion Fireclaw. I had to look at this myself, because I said the Dion Fireclaws. Dion was just a kid back then. Well, it turns out that Guido Hibden, his dad, designed this and named it after Dion.
That's cute.
And but along those lines, just for any of you that might, Dion is in real bad health at the moment. He needs a kidney transplant. And, you know, that's a tough one. If any of you happen to just, out of some miracle, know someone or something, I'm not very educated on that subject, but it kind of touched me when I saw it. Okay, does any of you out there, and of course you can't answer me, but I'm going to ask anyway, know what the first lipless crankbaits were? Anyone there? Okay, I'm going to give you a chance to think. Okay, it wasn't a Cordell spot. I know some of you said that. A lot of you are going to say probably a rattle trap. No, it wasn't. It was one of these type right here, and there was two of them, and I can't remember. Pico made one, and this one was made by Whopper Stopper, called the Bio Boogie. This was the very first lipless crankbaits. And I fished them. My dad actually used to troll one on Lake Houston in Texas. And the first time I ever saw us catch a double, he was trolling, we weren't casting. But
I think it's interesting how they got the order form in here.
yeah,
because people used to mail it in and order it directly out of the magazine.
Yeah, and that gave the company a kind of a good indication if their ad was worth anything.
Yeah, so. Makes sense.
And look at this, 1982, and look what they're talking about. We just got back from the Texas Parks and Wildlife ceremony, which are called the Share the Lunker program. And this is speculating, this article on this up-and-coming Lake Fork, and it has come true. It's come reality. It was theory a lot, but it's totally, become reality. And this article goes through how they staged the level, how even before, and this I think in like 1978, they had made ponds where the lake was going to be, and they started stocking those ponds with Florida bass. And it's obviously.
So then when they filled the lake up, those ponds integrated?
Yeah, those ponds all the fish in those ponds were Florida fish, so they didn't, and they had grown to certain sizes. So, and then they did other stockings as time went by, but still, this was a really unique thing they did, and they talked that but anyway, it was again the Texas Parks and Wildlife. Even this, like almost 50 years ago, were trying to do some really innovative, amazing things. And there's blonde-haired, one of the two blonde-haired boys and I'm really glad I'm getting to refresh my memory how good he was, because we all, as athletes age and young athletes start to displace them in our minds, we forget. And gosh, he was so dang good,
And his name is?
Roland Martin. Of course, I don't think, the only person you could possibly confuse him with would be Jimmy Houston, blonde hair, no hat, but Roland wore a hat most of the time, unlike Jimmy. And this is just a personal deal. Probably one of the sponsors I was with the least amount of time in my career, but was one of the very, very best, was Coleman Camping. I'm probably going to need to explain that briefly here because a lot of you don't even know that. But back when I went with Skeeter, Jerry Myers and Skeeter, Coleman was the company that eventually bought Skeeter from Jerry Myers out in Texas. And they asked him the question, they said, how do you advertise your boats? You do so well. And Jerry told them, we don't. We have a fishing team. It was like a 5, 6, 7-man fishing team then. And they said, really? That's all you did? And he said, yeah. Coleman doubled every pro's pay. Doubled it, every one. And then they did other things for me, sent me a lot of good camping equipment and stuff. So, but then unfortunately there was a hostile takeover of Coleman by Revlon, and they fired all the Coleman family from the Coleman. So that didn't last very long. That's how I ended up with Johnny. It was once that hostile takeover took place. I didn't know anybody at Skeeter anymore. Everybody had left. Again, we come in conclusion of April 1982.